The first report from Hiroshima did not arrive as a report. It arrived as a silence. At 8:16 on the morning of August 6, 1945, a communications officer inside Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo tried to reach the 2nd Army Headquarters in Hiroshima. The line had gone dead. He tried again. Nothing. He pushed the request through another route, then another, then through the Japanese National Railway's telegraph office. Still nothing came back from the city. Not a casualty count. Not a damage map. Not a commander's warning. Just a missing voice from a military headquarters that had been there a minute before. And at first, Tokyo had no category for that. The only hard fact they had was small enough to sound almost harmless. A single B-29 had been tracked over Hiroshima that morning, high above the city, roughly 31,000 feet up. The air raid warning had already been lifted. The aircraft had not been intercepted. For weeks, American bombers flying alone, or in pairs, had been treated as reconnaissance flights. Too expensive to chase. Too ordinary to fear. That morning, ordinary became a word nobody in Tokyo could use. At 8:15, the B-29 Enola Gay, flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets, had released one bomb over Hiroshima. One aircraft, one bomb. A uranium weapon detonating about 1,900 feet above the center of the city. The center did not burn first. It vanished first. The blast flattened buildings within about a mile of the hypocenter. Fire spread through miles of broken streets. Communications, command, police records, hospital records, family records, the administrative skeleton of the city all collapsed at once. But in Tokyo, the silence was still being treated like a communications problem. Hours passed before headquarters began to understand that it was not the line that had failed. It was the city. A Japanese pilot was diverted toward Hiroshima. From the air, he radioed back what he saw. The city was hidden under a giant mass of smoke and dust. He could not tell where Hiroshima ended. He could not give Tokyo the report it wanted, because the military vocabulary available to him did not contain what he was looking at. There was no column for this, no existing damage category, no command form that could turn one flash into the disappearance of a headquarters. That evening, Imperial General Headquarters issued its first public statement. It said Hiroshima had been attacked by a small number of B-29s. It said considerable damage had been suffered. It said a new type of bomb appeared to have been used. Every phrase was careful. Every phrase was technically defensible. And almost none of it told the truth. Because a small number of B-29s meant one. Considerable damage meant the functional destruction of a city. And new type of bomb meant a weapon so far outside Japan's war experience that even the people controlling the language did not yet know how much of the truth the language was hiding. The Army's Information Bureau moved fast. Not to explain Hiroshima, to contain Hiroshima. The phrase, new type of bomb, was repeated. It was narrow. It was useful. It kept the disaster inside a frame that still sounded military, still sounded manageable, still sounded like something that could be studied, resisted, and absorbed into doctrine. Then, on August 7th, President Harry Truman named the weapon publicly from Washington. The bomb was atomic. The force that powered the sun, he said, had been turned against Japan. He warned that if Japan did not accept Allied terms, destruction from the air would continue on a scale never seen before. Now Japan's leadership had a name for the silence. But a name was not a decision. Inside the army, the real question was not what Hiroshima had been hit with. The real question was what admitting it would force them to do next. General Seizo Arisu, chief of Army Intelligence, flew toward Hiroshima to see the damage himself. He did not go because Tokyo had no information. He went because the information Tokyo already had was too dangerous to say aloud. From the air, Hiroshima looked as if a wound had been opened in the earth. The rivers were still there. The bridges were still there. But along the banks, the city that gave those bridges meaning had been stripped away. Arisu's team landed outside Hiroshima and moved toward the ruins on foot. The ground still held heat. The smell reached them before the details did. Survivors moved through the wreckage in ways that did not match the pattern of firebombing. Some had terrible burns. Others had no visible wound and still could not stand. Doctors who were still alive were describing symptoms that did not fit any known military medical category. The team's physicist took measurements. Residual radiation was detected in the soil. He did not need a completed report to confirm what Washington had already announced. This had been an atomic bomb. Arisu returned to Tokyo and gave the army what it had been waiting for: confirmation. And the army's public position did not collapse. It adapted. The next line was not surrender. It was mitigation. Military experts, the army said, were investigating the weapon. The damage was severe, but the effects of atomic attack could be reduced by proper dispersal, sufficient shelter, discipline under fire, and continued preparation. The words turned Hiroshima into a problem of technique. If the population dispersed better, if shelters were improved, if discipline held, then the bomb could be endured. That statement was not made from ignorance. Army leaders knew the weapon was atomic. They knew Hiroshima had contained roughly 350,000 people. They knew the final death toll by the end of 1945 would reach into the tens of thousands upon tens of thousands, ultimately estimated between 90,000 and 140,000. They knew the Second Army headquarters had been hit. They knew General Shunroku Hata had survived only because he was away from the center of the blast. They knew a field army had effectively disappeared as a functioning command. None of that entered the sentence the public was allowed to hear. War Minister Korochika Anami understood the meaning of the bomb. But understanding was not the same as yielding. Since April, Anami had been responsible for Japan's final home defense plan, Operation Ketsugo. The plan rested on one brutal assumption. If American troops invaded the home islands, Japan could make the invasion so costly that the Allies might accept negotiated terms instead of unconditional surrender. Every soldier, every aircraft, every suicide weapon, every civilian mobilization order pointed toward that premise. And on August 8th, Anami still believed the premise could survive Hiroshima. One bomb, however terrible, did not prove that the invasion strategy was dead. That was the Army's private line, and its public line. Investigation would continue. Resistance would continue. The language would hold. What Anami did not know that evening was that another B-29 had already left Tinian Island. This one carried a different weapon, a plutonium bomb. Larger, more complex, and already moving toward another Japanese city. By the next morning, Japan's leaders would be arguing about a second catastrophe before they had made a decision about the first. At 10:30 in the morning, on August 9th, the Supreme War Council met in emergency session. The subject was not Nagasaki. It was the Soviet Union. At 1 minute after midnight, Soviet forces had crossed into Japanese-held Manchuria from multiple directions. The Kwantung Army, Japan's great continental force, was under attack across a massive front. For months, Tokyo had hoped Moscow might somehow serve as a channel for negotiated peace. That hope ended before dawn. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had warned that Japan needed to move before Soviet entry closed the last diplomatic exit. Now the exit was closed. He told the council they had to act immediately. Anami and Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu pushed back. Yes, the Soviet attack was serious. Yes, Manchuria was collapsing into crisis. But Manchuria was not the home islands. Ketsugo, they argued, remained viable. The coming American invasion could still be made costly enough to force terms. The argument was still alive at 11:02 a.m. That was when the B-29 Boxcar, flown by Major Charles Sweeney, released the second atomic bomb over Nagasaki. The bomb detonated about 1,650 feet over the Urakami district. Its explosive yield was larger than the Hiroshima bomb. The surrounding hills shaped the destruction, blocking it in some directions and driving it harder in others. Tens of thousands died within hours. By the end of 1945, the death toll would be estimated between 60,000 and 80,000. But the council did not know that while it argued. At first, Nagasaki arrived the same way Hiroshima had arrived. In fragments. A flash. A great explosion. Fires. Communications gone. No clean report. No complete picture. No word yet attached firmly to the damage. It did not need one. The pattern was already recognizable. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki received the first report during a break. Suzuki was 77 years old, a former admiral, a survivor of an assassination attempt by army extremists in 1936, a man who had learned to speak in public without revealing the full shape of what he believed. Privately, he knew the war could not be won. Publicly, he had to move inside a government where the army could still destroy any cabinet that seemed to be surrendering too quickly. When the council reconvened, Nagasaki was now part of the room. 2 atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion, a collapsing empire, and still, the 6 men responsible for ending the war could not agree on what ending meant. Anami insisted Japan must demand 4 conditions. The imperial system must be preserved. Japan must control its own war crimes prosecutions. There must be no Allied occupation of the home islands. Japanese forces must disarm themselves under Japanese authority. To Anami, those conditions proved that Japan was negotiating, not collapsing. To Togo, they proved the opposite. The Allies would reject them immediately. The only condition Japan might have any chance of preserving was the Kokutai, the imperial system itself. Everything else had to be abandoned. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai supported Togo. He did not need to say the Navy was gone as a serious fighting force. Everyone in the room already knew. Knowing did not create agreement. By evening, the council was still divided. The same 6 men, the same split, the same language. 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet invasion had not produced a decision. They had only forced the deadlock into the open. Shortly before midnight, Suzuki asked for something no modern Japanese prime minister had ever asked for in this way: an imperial conference. Not a ceremonial meeting, not a ratification, a decision. The conference began beneath the imperial palace at 11:50 that night. The room was underground, cramped, and heavy with summer air. The emperor sat above the ministers. The men below him stated their positions. Anami presented the 4-condition approach. Togo presented the 1-condition approach. The argument returned to the same place it had been all day: a deadlock. Then Suzuki turned to Emperor Hirohito and asked him to speak. For nearly 2 decades, Hirohito had reigned over a system built to turn consensus into imperial approval. Now the system had failed to produce consensus at all. The emperor stood, His words were not long, but they broke the mechanism that had trapped the government. He said that continuing the war would lead to the destruction of the Japanese people and the obliteration of the nation. He said Japan had to endure what was unbearable. He accepted the one-condition approach. Anami did not argue. He did not say he had changed his mind. He bowed. The conference ended around 2:30 in the morning on August 10th. At 7 a.m., Japan transmitted its acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration through neutral channels in Switzerland and Sweden, with one condition attached: preservation of the imperial system. For the first time, surrender had entered Japan's official outward communication. But inside Japan, the army still did not speak that word. Anami sent instructions to senior officers. Negotiations were underway. Discipline was to be maintained. Combat readiness was to continue. He did not tell them what the emperor had said underground. He did not tell them that the decision had already been forced from above. The language still held the army in place, even as the government began moving away from the position that language defended. Then the Allied answer arrived. Secretary of State James F. Burns responded for the Allies. The emperor could remain, but from the moment of surrender he would be subject to the authority of the supreme commander for the Allied powers. The final form of Japan's government would be determined by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. The word that stopped the room was subject. Anami read it as the destruction of the Kokutai. If the emperor answered to a foreign commander, then the imperial system had not truly been preserved. The army could still reject the terms. Togo read the same sentence differently. The emperor remained, the dynasty continued, the institution survived, even under occupation. The council was divided again. The decision of August 10th had not ended the argument. It had only moved the argument one step closer to the point where no procedure could hide it. On August 14th, a second imperial conference was called. This time, Hirohito did not wait for every argument to be rebuilt from the beginning. He stated that his decision had not changed. He had reviewed the Allied response. He accepted it. He ordered the government to prepare the instrument of surrender. Then he made another decision no Japanese emperor had made before. He would speak directly to the people by radio. The recording was made inside the imperial palace that afternoon. The emperor read a prepared script in formal court language. It accepted the Potsdam Declaration. It did not use the word surrender. It said the war situation had developed in a way not necessarily favorable to Japan. It asked the people to bear what could not be borne. The voice was recorded onto discs. Those discs became the most dangerous objects in Japan, because if the army could not stop the decision in the council chamber, some officers believed they could still stop the voice. That night, Major Kenji Hatanaka and a faction of officers inside the Imperial Guards attempted to seize the palace. Their goal was simple: find the recording, destroy it, prevent the broadcast, keep the war alive by force. Hatanaka tried to win senior army support and failed. He moved anyway. When General Takeshi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guards Division, refused to support forged orders for the coup, Hatanaka killed him. The palace was sealed. Troops searched the grounds. For several hours, the conspirators controlled the place where they believed the emperor's recorded voice was hidden. They never found it. The discs had been moved. By dawn on August 15th, the Eastern District Army refused to support the coup. Without that support, the rebellion had no path. Hatanaka left the palace and walked into the streets of Tokyo, handing out leaflets explaining why he had tried to stop the surrender. Soon after, he took his own life. War Minister Anami did not hear the broadcast either. Before noon, he was already dead. In the early morning of August 15th, he knelt in his brother-in-law's home and performed ritual suicide. He left a note apologizing to the emperor for what he called a great crime. He did not define the crime. Failure to win. Failure to prevent surrender. Failure to control the army. The ambiguity remained because Anami removed himself before history could force him to explain it. At noon, the emperor's voice crossed Japan by radio. For many citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. The language was difficult. The meaning was not. The war was ending. Suzuki's cabinet resigned. Togo survived the war, was tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and died in prison in 1950. Umezu signed the formal instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, as the representative of Imperial General Headquarters. Witnesses remembered him weeping. The surrender document contained no Japanese conditions. The imperial institution survived, but not because the document promised it in the language Japan had demanded. It survived inside the Allied occupation settlement that followed. The condition Japan had fought to preserve was absorbed into a surrender that no longer needed to call itself conditional. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the accounting continued long after the government's language changed. By the end of 1945, between 110,000 and 210,000 people had died across the two cities. The range itself is part of the devastation. In cities where records, offices, hospitals, and families were destroyed together, even counting the dead became a broken act of reconstruction. In Nagasaki's Urakami district, the remains of Urakami Cathedral became one of the scars left in stone. A statue of the Virgin Mary recovered from the rubble survived with one side of its face burned away by the heat. It is still there, not as a military argument, not as a diplomatic condition, as evidence that the words "considerable damage" had once been asked to carry more horror than words could hold. The 9 days from August 6th to August 15th did not expose a lack of information. Tokyo learned what Hiroshima was. It learned what Nagasaki was. It learned the Soviets had entered the war. It learned the invasion strategy was collapsing under the weight of events. What failed was not intelligence. It was institutional language. Japan's leaders had built a vocabulary of resistance strong enough to absorb one atomic bomb, then two, then a Soviet invasion, then a deadlocked council, then an Allied ultimatum. That vocabulary could delay a decision. It could disguise a decision. It could punish anyone who spoke too plainly. But it could not end the war. For that, the emperor had to speak twice in rooms where the government had run out of words. And then, at noon on August 15th, his recorded voice did what 9 days of official statements had failed to do. It made silence impossible. The war was over.